the new edition comes out in December of this year, they put that off until 2021, it will probably go to 11 or 12 pages. Hopefully it won't, but don't be surprised. And the reason is what they're trying to do is make it easier for you not to have to get into disputes, and make it easier for your consumers not to be in disputes, and that's really what we're going to be talking about this morning. It's how it works, why we do it, and how to think about it. Okay? So, are we ready to begin?
Yes.
Okay.
Ready.
I'll see you all next week.
Is that your birthday present to yourself,
That
Michael?
was the introduction to the introduction. So really, my first question, and I always ask this before any class, first of all, how many of you are experienced agents? I know at least 2 of you are. 3, 4, okay. Any brand new agents? Brand new, perfect. I'm glad we have one brand new agent, because that gives me an excuse to go through all my stuff, and I'm
Yes.
not going through all my stuff. And the rest of you can't complain because we have a brand new agent, okay?
Refresher's
So-
good.
So the first question I always ask, and it's kind of a philosophical question, but it's kind of a practical question. What is a contract?
A binding agreement,
Okay,
legally binding agreement.
okay. Anybody else?
It's a promise to do something for compensation of some
Right.
sort,
It's a promise to do something in return for something else.
or something else.
Now, there are different kinds of contracts. We don't need to be concerned about all the legal ins and outs of contracts. But the basic real estate contract is what's called a bilateral contract, and that means there's 2 parties involved and they each make promises to each other, okay? There are such things as unilateral contracts, which means just one party has promised to do something. And, but we have bilateral contracts, and it's really just a promise to pay in return for something. It's called consideration is the legal term that's used, but it could be for money, it could be for performance in some way, it could be for anything that you can do as a person in return for something that somebody else can do as a person can constitute a contract, okay? Now, we all know from our real estate classes when we got our license, in what form does a real estate contract need to be? Written, correct. Now, that means, of course, since it says it has to be written, that means there are such things as oral contracts, right? But are they permitted in the real estate context?
No. I mean, maybe.
I'll give you an answer. You'll give me an answer. I'll go like that. And you'll go, oh, well, maybe not. But actually, that's correct. I'm just trying to throw you off. No, you cannot have oral contracts. It's required by law. There are statutes. It's called the statute of frauds, and there are California laws that state that to be enforceable, a real estate contract must be in writing. Okay? So what's the implication of that in your process of kind of your day-to-day business in the real estate world when you're meeting with customers and you're meeting with potential, let's say you're a listing agent and you're receiving offers and you're doing all of these things. What's the implication of, to be enforceable, real estate related contracts must be in writing?
Well, nothing's valid until it's actually signed by both of the parties, so.
That's right, everybody hear that?
Someone can promise you something, if they don't come through, then it doesn't.
So how enforceable is that phone call from the agent that says, oh yeah, we'll agree to lower it $10,000. How enforceable is that? 0, right? Not enforceable. Now, do agents talk to each other that way? Yes, of course they do. Of course you do. I mean, if you had to put everything in writing back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, you'd spend a lot of time writing things that wouldn't necessarily lead to anything. For example, as soon as you say, hey, okay, we'll give you 10,000 more, and they say, I'm sorry, we want 20,000 more. Well, you could have put the 10,000 in writing, and they could have put the 20,000 in writing. But sometimes it's more efficient to have a conversation, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Because we're dealing with a lot of different terms that can be resolved a lot of different ways, because there's not that many rules that are hard and fast in real estate negotiations. You can kind of almost do anything in terms of how you buy a house, as there are different words in the English language, different ways to do things. But what happens, once you kind of reach that basic agreement on the phone, what do you need to do?
Follow up in writing.
Yes, you need to reduce it in writing, and what else? Get it signed by all of the parties. It does, I can't tell you how many times somebody has come into my office, so, we talked about it on the phone, they said this, and I sent them an email to confirm it. And now they're saying it's not valid. And she said, I put it in writing, but was it signed by everybody? The answer, that's a rhetorical question, the answer was no, it wasn't. So you need to use the forms, use the addendums. When you're dealing with contracts, you need to use the forms and the addendums. And we'll learn all about those, but I'm just kind of giving you the overview at this point. Think of this process that you are in as real estate agents as a written, a profession of writing, okay? You write things down, you make notes, you reduce them to binding contracts, and you have the parties sign the contract, okay? And then you have an agreement. All right, so any questions on that kind of basic overall concept? Okay, so what are the essentials of a contract? You need to understand this, because if you're gonna enter into a contract, what has to be present for a contract to be binding, other than being in writing? Any ideas?
An offer, consideration, and acceptance.
Well, consideration certainly.
Yeah, maybe the terms, I guess.
Yeah, you've got, well, let's go through them. I'm gonna check them off as we say them here, okay? So, consideration, what is consideration?
Payment, action.
Money.
It's
Right.
anything
Mm-hmm. Anything that is.
that is of value.
Mm-hmm.
It can be money, it can be an agreement to fix the patio, it could be all of these things that can be performed in some way and given to the other side are consideration, okay? So you have to have consideration. If I just promise to do something for you and don't get anything in return, is that a binding contract? No, it's
No.
not. It's simply my offer to give you a gift. I'm gonna give you $20,000. Can you enforce
I'll
that?
take it.
Can you enforce that? No, you can't.
I'd like.
You can't enforce that. Unless I'm asking you to do something in return. I'll give you $20,000 if you'll go set up that house for me and get it all staged, and that'll come out of my commission. How's that? Could you do that? Absolutely, I would too. That's why I'm not gonna give you $20,000 for doing that. But that's consideration. When I ask you to do something in return for something, that's consideration. If I just offer you something and there's nothing that you need to do in return, that's what we call a gift. And sometimes, I don't want to get all the legal technicalities, sometimes gifts can be enforced, but most of the time not. I can choose not to give a gift even after I have offered to give you a gift, and I won't ask what the term we use in America for that is, because we have someone of extraction in the back of the room.
Don't mind me.
You just got it. But that's what gifts are, that's what a contract is, that's what consideration is. What else do we need? What if I am standing on the corner, babbling out of my mind about the space invaders that I'm seeing on top of the buildings around me, and I'm warning everybody, they're coming, they're coming. The extraterrestrials are coming.
You could be a sound mind.
Mhm.
I was gonna say, would you be safe in entering into a contract with me?
No.
Probably not, right? You've gotta have a sound mind, competent parties, the term is competent is the legal term that's used. And it simply means, simply stated, that the parties need to understand, be capable of understanding what they are doing. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So, if they can understand what they're doing, then they can enter into a contract. If they can't understand what they're doing, then they cannot enter into a contract. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Now, that means, in general, most people that you run into, in contracts, say you go to somebody's house, you wanna get a listing agreement, all of that kind of stuff, most of the time, you'll know within 30 seconds whether you need to be concerned about somebody. Because they'll be able to talk rationally to you, and they'll start talking about, here's what I think I should get for the house, what do we need to do? Do I need to dress it up? You know, all of those kind of things, right? But there are certain people, certain categories of people that you need to be a little more alert about. And what do you think that would be?
Capacity?
Capacity, right, we're talking about competence, so that's the correct capacity. So what group of people do we need to just,
Maybe
The elderly.
Legal age of entering a contract?
both ends of the age
Mhm.
spectrum, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't make a contract if you're under 18.
No, legal adult.
So if you're dealing with somebody who says they own a house and they, look like they're 15, they can't enter into an agreement with you unless they can establish that they're over 18. That's the age to contract, all right? And then the other end of the spectrum is that we know that as, life goes on, people can, not always and not all the time, certainly not, but people can lose their ability to think properly or to think clearly. And they can get confused, and when you start asking questions, they may ask you to repeat a lot, or they may go back to the question that you originally asked and you have already answered. Those kind of things that indicate that somebody's not quite getting it. You need to be alert to that in case, so that you don't enter into contracts with people that are not capable of understanding what they're agreeing to. Yes, Tom?
Not to go on, because I never had this situation, but let's say someone, since you mentioned 18, someone inherits a property, they're the only heir, and they're 15 years old.
Mhm.
What happens? And they want to sell it.
Well, they may want to sell it, but they'll need to talk to the adult who has responsibility for managing that party. And that party actually too. Usually there's a trustee involved, there's a guardian involved, there's a conservator involved, someone who is of age that can speak and act for the individual who is not competent. And that applies to both ends of the spectrum. You'll have a lot of wise people who are getting older will have their properties in trusts of some sort, in living trusts or in some facility or entity where someone who is competent is managing it. And that's the person you need to deal with if you're going to enter into a contract related to that property. When someone dies, it's gonna be an executor or a trustee. There's all sorts of situations where you're dealing with people that are not the actual owner or party in interest in the property, but they're acting for someone else. So you just need to be alert to that, and it's not gonna be a problem 99% of the time, but every once in a while it is. And we had a case here not too long ago where an agent entered into a listing agreement with someone she thought was competent, but her kids later claimed that he wasn't, and it ended up in a big dispute. So, you just have to be alert to that. Alright, so we got competent parties, we got consideration. Somebody mentioned the word terms. Specific terms. Okay? You need, specificity is important for a contract to be enforceable, right? If it's not specific, how can anybody who's judging that look at it and say, well, here's what you're supposed to do? If you say you're gonna paint the house, it might be smart to specify what color.
And what is being painted?
Well, yeah, you've been there, you obviously
Yes.
been there. Paint the house.
What part of that
Now,
house?
okay, I mean, we all kinda have an idea of what painting the house means, don't we? But when you're getting down with a painting contractor, they're gonna have a different idea of painting the house than you are as a general person just looking at the house from the street corner. What about the eaves? What about the windows? What about the window sills? What about the inside of the house? What about, you know?
How many coats?
How many coats? What kind of paint? What's the quality of the paint? What color? More than one color. I mean, there's a lot of
Type.
things
Finish. Mhm.
that can be specified, and you need to think in those terms. See, you need to be the one that's helping your client think these things through. And you need to be alert to where the problems can arise and deal with them before the problems arise. Because one of the things, in fact, we're gonna go back just real quickly. We talked about why is it in writing, right? It needs to be in writing, but I'm not sure I asked why is it in writing? Why does it need to be in writing? Why can't I shake hands with you and say, you know, I'll buy your house for $1 million?
Because people lie.
That's true. That's the practical answer. Yeah, but it's a little different than that. Let's say everybody's not lying. Does everybody remember everything? the
No,
same?
it
has to
becomes
be
a he said,
enforceable
she said.
later.
Mhm.
Right?
Mhm.
And isn't that often what
Perception.
creates disputes?
Mhm.
Well, you said you were gonna do this. Oh, no, what I meant, or the other thing is what I meant was, right? They use some general phrase and then it comes more specific. You know, well, you said you were gonna fix the pool. Well, what I meant was I was gonna top off the water level. Oh, well, I thought you meant you were gonna replaster the whole thing. Is there a little bit of a difference in the cost of those particular items? Yeah.
Sounds like it.
Right, there it is. And so, we want to be things in writing so that we have the ability to avoid disputes. And your job is to make sure things are specific enough that people understand on both sides. And you ask the questions that allow the writing to reflect what the mutual understanding of the parties is. And do you think that helps when it comes down to the end, when you're getting ready to close and they're going through the final walkthrough and they're looking through their checklist to see what the seller was supposed to have done before it closes? Of course it does.
Mhm.
The more specific you are there, it's very easy for the buyer's agent or the seller's agent to say, we agreed to fix the receptacle in the dining room over in the corner, and here it works, versus fix the electrical outlet, which could be anywhere in the house, right? So just be alert to that. I mean, it's one of those things that as you train yourself and as you think about things, it'll become second nature. I mean, I know when Dale's doing contracts and then when the Nashes are doing contracts, all this stuff just kind of pops in there right away. The specifying language just comes in there. And that's what you need to train yourself to do, be specific and to write it down. Now, okay, so specificity, what else do we need for this?
Start date.
What's that?
The start date.
Well, that's part of being specific,
Yes.
but timeframes
Mhm.
is also,
Talk about
timeframes are
that,
really
start date, end
essential,
date,
and you
yeah.
have to, for example, on a listing agreement, you must have an ending date. If you don't have an ending date on a listing agreement, it's not enforceable, period. And you need to have closing dates, all the timeframes need to be specified. That's
Identified.
part of being specific, but particularly pay attention to how long you have to do things, when they have to be done by, what's involved, and all of those kind of things that are part of the process. And we'll get into that as we go through the contract, because the contract has several parts, and it's kind of, it's an interesting process, the way this contract is written. So we've got, timeframes. It has to be capable of being performed. And I know that's not something that you would necessarily think of, but as lawyers we do. If the promise is to do something that can't be done, then it's not enforceable.
Mm-hmm. Can you give some examples of that?
Yeah, move the mountain from here.
Yeah. In
I mean,
home.
theoretically you
Yeah,
could, I
sure.
guess, but if you don't own that property and, those kind of things.
Right.
Then,
Common walls, that's
Yeah.
another thing,
Yeah.
thinking real estate wise.
so it just needs to be capable of performance. That's not usually a problem. Most of the time people are talking about things that are capable of performing. And there has to be mutual consent. Okay? Both sides have to agree to everything that's in the contract. We have a process that we'll get into as we get going. We'll have a process where we have offers and counter offers and back and forth, and it's not done, and nothing is binding until there's mutual consent to all of the terms in all of the offers and counter offers. The fact that you're 99% of the way there, you don't have an enforceable contract. And there's a process for getting there, and we'll go through all of that as part of this. Okay, any questions on any of that, comments, suggestions, observations? Okay.
Hallucination.
Pretty straightforward, but how many of you, those of you that have been doing real estate, I know have done this, I assume you've gone into zip forms and you've looked at the whole list of contracts that are available, right? Now, have you done that, new agent haven't done that? Okay, that's something that you should do, and, what I'd like everybody to do, but especially those that are not as familiar with the contract as others, is before next week, print out a copy of the contract and read it. I say print out, I know it's really common for people just to put stuff on a screen and read through it, but I think one learns better when you've printed it out and you can check things off and make notes and circle things and what's that, the little question mark. Because I want you to come back next week having reviewed the contract. Now, I don't expect you to understand it all necessarily, but I would like for you to have read it. So when I say this paragraph deals with this, you'll understand what I'm talking about and you won't be seeing it for the first time. And that way, if you have any questions as you're going through, hopefully I address them, and if I don't, then you can raise them as we go through. So, but there are a lot of forms in there, and that's really to help you to reduce everything to writing. Because what are you not? What am I that you are not? That's it, yeah. I am licensed in a way that I can sit down and am authorized to prepare legal documents from scratch. Like you can come to me and say, we want to do this, and I'm authorized because I've been trained and I've been licensed by the state to sit down and prepare a specific contract for you for whatever that situation is. Are you, as real estate agents, trained in the same way?
No.
You're not authorized to practice law, right? So what CAR has done is create an entire catalog of forms that their lawyers have looked at that are intended to guide the parties with what are considered kind of the normal terms, the usual terms of all the various aspects of real estate. So you'll see that, and they're really helpful because they just keep you out of arguments. And so here's what the form says. So everybody has more or less agreed that that's the way we're going to do things. They can all be modified, but I would recommend that you try to stay with the formats that are in the form as much as you can. I mean, sometimes there are special situations. But if it gets too wild, then you need to come to me, or you need to go to Dale, or get somebody else who's a mentor to help you through situations that may not be standard, rather than get into the area of trying to practice law yourself, okay? So So why is it called an RPA? Real estate purchase agreement, residential purchase agreement, right?
Mhm.
Versus an RSA, residential sales agreement. A simple little question, but, and it doesn't really mean anything, I just thought I'd throw it out. See what the ideas are.
Yeah, it's weird because like, when you're purchasing a property, sometimes they'll call you the selling agent. instead of
We'll
the
get into
listing.
that, and I hate
So-
those terms, and actually, those are antiquated now, they're gonna
Yeah, I don't
drop
know.
out, but anyway. No, you're right, though, that's confusing. The
It is
selling,
confusing.
it seems like we're selling a property,
Yeah.
so why is it called a purchase agreement? If I'm own a property and I'm selling it, why, you know, my feelings would be hurt if it's called a purchase agreement. Should they be? It's very simple, okay? Who is the agreement prepared by? By a buyer,
Mhm.
right? By a buyer's agent, for a buyer.
Who's purchasing it?
Who's purchasing it? That's right, that's all you need to know. That the buyer is making an offer to purchase the property. And the seller is deciding whether or not to accept that offer. So that's why it's called an RPA and not an RSA. Thought you, next time you're over drinks with somebody who's another agent, you can ask them that question, see if
Trick question.
So, this is kind of a general term. What do you think a contingency is? Has everybody heard that term, contingency?
The right, we can cancel the contract.
Yes, I mean, as a result of contingencies, one may be able to cancel a contract.
Maybe like a condition that needs to be met.
It's more like, there are conditions and there are contingencies, and they're slightly different.
Mhm.
But a contingency is an item that's for the benefit of one party that has to be resolved before that party is bound, okay? Then you're gonna find, when we get into the contract, we have a lot of contingencies. And those contingencies mean that until I've satisfied, the term used, satisfied that contingency, I'm not bound to proceed with the contract. Now, I am bound to proceed in good faith in trying to resolve the contingencies, but I'm not bound to complete the contract at that point. And what is a condition? A condition is just, it's really a third-party event or an outside thing that needs to occur before a party is obligated to proceed. And it's not related to when I think about something. Contingencies are really related to events that need to occur that are related to the parties between them. Conditions are something like the property needs to have clear title. Now, some people call that a contingency, it's really a condition.
Mhm.
Just pointing that out. Another condition would be receipt of the escrow money, right? They don't put any money in escrow. That's a condition that hasn't
Yeah.
been satisfied, okay? And, just so you know, the contract that we're dealing with, was last revised in December of 2018. It is in the process of being revised, and the latest word I saw was the newest version will be released in December of 2021, so that's this year, by the end of the year. And so we'll all wait to see what they're gonna be doing with that. A lot of times they float out various things that they're gonna do, and then they don't necessarily adopt them all. But they're usually, at this point, they're usually refining and not doing major overhauls. This contract has been through a big rewrite over the last 15 to 20 years. And, so what you learned today will still be applicable, although obviously we'll switch to the new contract when the time comes.
What's being added?
Don't know yet. And what I'll try to do is get an update on that so that we can, as we go through it, I'd be able to point out some things to you that they're thinking about moving or updating. Okay, so any questions so far? Now, this is purely a way that I like to think about the contract, but I'm gonna give it to you as a freebie. It's not a legal thing per se. But most of us can relate to it. So how many of us have been in a relationship? Anybody never been in a relationship?
Any kind of relationship.
Whoa. Good. Because the contract is kind of interesting if you think about it in the context of relationships. At least I think it is. Relationships. So maybe that's my love language, so to speak. But and I look at it as kind of the basic structure is like a relationship that leads to marriage and then the aftermath of that. Okay? So, and the basic contract kind of deals with that approach. If you think about a real estate transaction, I mean, what's the first thing that people are doing in a real estate transaction? What's that?
Negotiating.
Well, no, that's not the first thing they're doing. They're not negotiating. That comes later, but.
Lease agreement,
What's that?
lease agreement.
No, I'm not talking about leases, I'm talking about purchases.
They're
Making an offer.
They're looking, that's what they're doing, right? And what do we call that? Dating? Kind of looking for available people. Sometimes they go on dating sites and various things. And what do people do when they're in real estate? What do you think Zillow is? It's a dating site, in case you didn't know. Okay, Redfin is a dating site. Realtor.com is a dating site. And then if they're interested in dating that particular property, what do? They either contact a realtor to help them look at it, or they'll contact the realtor directly who has the listing, one or the other. And so, what's the next thing one does when one is dating and starts to get serious? What happens next, often?
Prepare documents, like
What's that?
prepare documents.
Right, but I'm talking about analogies now. What happens in a relationship? You date for a while,
You create
Right.
exclusivity.
Get the information.
and then after about 12, 14 years, what happens?
No, 12, 14 years.
Most people don't think it takes that long.
Make a commitment.
You make a commitment. You create
Proposal,
exclusivity.
right? Somebody
Right.
makes a proposal. They get down on one knee and, right? Get the rings out and all of that. So that would be, what's that the equivalent to in a real estate transaction? An offer. That's exactly right. I'm making an offer to you. Have you accepted it yet? So it really is just a proposal. And it's not a done deal until there's an acceptance, right? Now what happens when in a relationship, what do we call it when somebody accepts the proposal? They are now what? Engaged, right? And that's very similar to the time. What do people do during an engagement? Why don't they get married the next day?
They have to prepare.
Well, they have to prepare things, yeah, they do have to prepare things, but often engagements will be entered into in the heat of the moment. There's a lot of emotion. There's, all of this proposal and acceptance and all that stuff. But then there's a period of time with which they really kind of take a little harder look at each other, don't they? Oh God, the rest of my life with this person?
Sound like you
Does
do.
does that mean more than 3 years?
Hopefully.
Yeah, so people start to look a little more serious. So what are they doing in the real estate context? They're doing inspections. Right? They're checking schools out. They're reading the HOA document. Is this really what I thought it was. It looks beautiful on the outside. But how is it on the inside? How is it behind the siding? How is it under the roof? And that's the same thing we do in a relationship. We look more clearly, more deeply. We're not necessarily, I mean, our attraction often in a relationship is relatively superficial early on. And as that relationship develops, it deepens because we're looking at things other than what is superficial. So we go through this process of, we open escrow, we have contingency periods to do certain things, and we make decisions about whether we're gonna continue in the relationship, right? So let's say this process goes on in a relationship, and now you receive the announcement in the mail, save the date. Anybody ever got one of those? Save the date. Save September 13th in my case. September 13th. Save the date. And it was a Friday too. And it worked out very well. We just did 35 years coming up on 36. So
Aww.
Congratulations.
I'm very happy about it. So you set the wedding date, right? Now what sets the quote wedding date in a real estate transaction? Those of you who are experienced will know this. What sets the wedding date?
Closing date, COE,
Say it again.
the closing date,
Closing date is the wedding date. What sets the wedding date? What makes it a firm date? Now, you've entered in a contract that says we want to close on or before a certain date, right? But what do you have to do before you're actually bound to do that?
the EMD in, the deposit in.
Gotta do a deposit. That happens early on though.
You have to remove all your contingencies.
That's the one, right? Before then, before you've removed your contingencies, you're still looking. You're still evaluating. I'm still thinking about whether I like that elementary school that's around the corner. Is that too close? Yeah, it's a little close, but boy, you know, our kids could just walk across the street and go to school. So there's all this thinking that's going on, and evaluating, and you're looking at the age of the appliances, and all the stuff that comes out of the inspection report, and all you're evaluating all of that. And the contract provides you need to, at some point, either what? Remove the contingencies or cancel the transaction. And we'll go through the whole process. I'm not trying to teach you the process at this point. Just give you some ideas of how to think about it. Once the contingencies are removed, the wedding date is set, and now a bride or a groom can still bolt. Not that that's never happened.
That's true. With consequences still.
And you know what? So can a buyer or a seller.
Mm-hmm.
But if a buyer or seller changes their mind after contingency removal, there will be consequences. Okay? In the case of a buyer, the buyer may lose some or all of their earnest money deposit if they simply walk away. If their agent, if the seller's agent has made sure that the liquidated damages provision, for example, is signed, then that's what can happen. A seller, let's say a seller just says, you know what? I've just decided I don't want to sell. I love this house. My kids were raised here. God, I know it's been 20 years since they left home, but I just can't get over it. As I've gone through this process, I wish I'd never agreed to it. I'm not going to close. So what options does the buyer have? Legal. Buyer can force the seller to complete the transaction once contingencies are removed. Okay? If the buyer hasn't removed contingencies, the buyer has no authority to force the seller to proceed. The only right the seller has is to cancel the transaction, because the buyer themselves are not there.
The seller, once the agreement acceptance, the seller no longer to have a right to cancel the.
Correct.
Yeah?
Yeah, seller just sits there and waits. Waits
At
for
the
the
beginning.
buyer to do whatever they're gonna do. That's right. So it's, you're right in that sense, like in a relationship, either side could walk away. In this case, it's the buyer that can walk away.
So let's flip it.
Let's flip it?
Contingencies are removing on the buyer.
Say that again?
The buyer wants to walk,
Buyer can always walk if they haven't removed
and
contingencies.
if the contingencies are removed.
Then they're gonna have their earnest money deposit is going to be at risk. We'll go over those provisions as we get through the contract specifically, but the bottom line is up to 3% of the deposit, up to 3% of the value of the house can be retained by the seller as damages in the case of a wrongful default in the contract by the buyer, after contingencies are removed.
The seller side still have contingency, right? We have a CR form, we have the seller remove all the contingencies.
No, sellers really don't have much in the way of contingencies. The primary contingency for a seller would be, we've gotta find a replacement house. In other words, I wanna sell this house, but only if I know that I can find a house to replace it, and I am able to find one, and I have found one. Dale, can you think of any other?
Well, I've
Seller
had a couple of times where the seller couldn't sell the house because it turned out they had too many liens. So
okay.
he had three ex-wives, and he had child support, and they all put liens on it, and it was almost twice as much as the house was worth. So the buyer was very frustrated, but what could the seller do? So that deal fell through. That was an example where the seller wasn't aware that all his ex-wives had put liens on the property.
That's true. Now, in that case,
That was title
let's
company.
go through the logic in that
But
case.
you don't get
okay?
the full title till you open escrow.
Mhm.
That's how we found out.
The title report, right.
Title report, yeah, but that's done once you've opened escrow. So people could, if Michael did services for you and you didn't pay him, he may just put a lien on your house for his services. You don't know he did that till you open escrow and the title company gives you a report. And says you have, and that's what happened,
Okay.
and we couldn't sell the house.
Yeah, but, does that mean the seller is then off the hook?
In that particular case, the buyer just walked because there was no solution for him to do that.
Yeah. Typically in that situation, seller is way overextended like that, they don't have any value that the buyer could go after. However, under the contract, the buyer could sue the seller and could collect the difference in the value between the next house that he buys, or he or she buys, and the house that they were gonna buy. Let's say, in Dale's case, it was a $600,000 house that was under contract, and there's $1 million in liens, and the seller can't clear the liens. The buyer could try to force the seller to clear the liens, but the seller doesn't have any money anyway. It's typically the situation if they're in that situation. The buyer may have legal rights, but they don't have any of what are called effective remedies. But they could sue the seller, and let's say the house down the street comes on the market, same model, essentially the same house, sells for $650,000. Now, the buyer's been damaged to the extent of $50,000, right? They had to pay $50,000 more for essentially the same house because the seller didn't perform. So theoretically, you could sue the seller and get a $50,000 judgment and add that on to all the other liens that are on that house. In which case, as Dale would have told his client well before that, don't bother, let's find another house. This is not worth
I was
the effort.
representing the seller.
Oh, you were representing
I'm
the
sorry,
seller?
for anyone, my friends would represent about, but what the good news is, 4 years later, that seller came back and he had removed most of those liens. He settled with his ex-wives, and we actually ended up selling it. So it did, well, there was a good ending, it just took a little bit.
And that's where your skill often as a real estate agent will come into play, because when those situations arise, you need to be able to advise your
Yeah.
client on, okay, what do I do next? How can I resolve this? And that's where the more experience you have, and I want to strongly encourage you, those of you who are younger in the business, talk to those who are older in the business when these things come up. When all of a sudden you come into something that is difficult, doesn't make sense, oh, it's gonna cause a problem in the transaction, this can actually blow everything up. Don't just let it happen. Get some advice. That's why we're here. That's part of what we do. Dale's your broker. If you don't already know that, you should. You know, I'm the lawyer. My office is right down the corner here. And we have a lot of other resources. So get some help in those situations. Because you're going to be who they're looking to. And that's how you build relationships and how you build long-term business, by the way, is you solve your client's problems on the first transaction. Guess what? They are a client for life. And I know Dale and Nash's have made a living off their clients for life, for a long time. He's always telling me, we'll pull off the lines here, come down to the office, or I'll go to his office, and oh, so-and-so called me from, 8 years ago. 8 years ago. They remember you. You have a lot of business, but they have one. They have one transaction. You've done 100 transactions since then, hopefully. So, it's a different kind of feel, but they remember. And they will call you. Especially if you do the kind of marketing campaigns that we at Keller Williams teach you about, just staying in touch, keeping your name in front of people. They will call you back, and that's how you build a long-term business. Okay? So, what's the equivalent of wedding day? Woo-hoo.
Closing escrow.
Closing day.
Closing
Yeah,
escrow,
closing day.
that's right. Everybody goes to the same place, they show up, all the bridesmaids and the groomsmen show up, and the escrow officer serves as the priest or the minister and makes everything official, and you are now married. And what happens the day after escrow closes?
Dishwasher breaks.
And what would you have bought, made sure that your client bought if that was gonna happen?
A warranty.
Warranty, that's right. No, and hopefully that doesn't happen, but it certainly has been known to happen. So what happens the day after? You probably haven't thought about this, but it's almost. If you've done your job right, it's an amicable divorce. Most buyers and sellers,
Yes.
once they've completed their transaction, really don't want to spend a lot of time with each other after that.
You move on.
And your hope is that they don't have to.
Yeah.
Okay? That's you have done your job. They are happily divorcing and shaking hands, and it's been real, it's been nice knowing you. As they're backing out the door from each other, okay? So my analogy falls apart a little bit. You don't stay married for 35 years in a real estate relationship. So I know it's kind of a long story. Hopefully it helped plant some seeds in your mind. But one thing you need to know, and this is kind of the basic question that you need to understand in real estate transactions, and when do you really have a deal? Now, I'm not talking about when you complete the negotiations for the terms, okay? I'm talking about when you really have a transaction.
In process, you mean?
I don't mean in process.
Mm.
It's in process from the day you sign the contract. But when do you really have a deal? You already said it once today.
When you close escrow.
No.
When all contingencies.
When contingencies are
okay,
removed.
yeah.
That's right. Yeah. When contingencies are removed. That's when you have an enforceable deal that either party can move forward and demand close. Before that time, it's open, especially on the buyer side. Okay? And that's when the deposit is at risk. Before then, the deposit is just being held by escrow. It's just sitting there. Nice to look at, nice for the seller to know that somebody was willing to put some money in escrow. But does it really have any value to the seller at that point? No, not really. Not until the contingencies are removed. Then that deposit means something, because under the terms of the contract, assuming that the seller hasn't defaulted in some way, that deposit belongs to the seller at that point in time. Okay? All right, any questions? All right, we got, it's about a quarter of, so we'll just take a few minutes. We're gonna go through some ancillary documents. As I said, I always do this because I know people come in and they haven't read the contract. It's fine, nobody has read it. But I want you to read it by next week, okay? Read through it, and you know, if you got time to read every little word, that'd be awesome. But if not, at least get through it and understand, see all the different sections that are in there, and so that we have a working framework that we can start talking about next week. But in the meantime, let's see if I can get this screen up. There we go. All right. What's neat about zip forms is, especially for newer agents, is when you pull up a document. Let's say you want to do the RPA, okay, residential purchase agreement. What it does is it packages for you all of the documents that are required to be done with the RPA. So it helps keep you from making a mistake by not completing the form that needs to be signed. Same thing happens with the listing agreement. When you pull up a listing agreement, boom, there are a bunch of ancillary documents that come up that go with that. And so anytime you open a form, if there's another document there, that means you need to look at that document and figure out what it's for, okay? So let's just go through the documents that are attached to the RPA. Okay, so what's this document called? First one that comes up.
Disclosure regarding real estate agency relationship.
Right, that's what that is. Now, what is that for? Now, I'm gonna ask you questions, and by the way, the answers are usually pretty obvious. So,
They're in
like
the title.
Like read the title of the document, that's right. So when I say, what is this document for, what's it for?
It's for agency.
Disclosing the real estate relationship.
Yes.
Okay? Now, why do we need to do that? Okay, that's the better question when you're looking at a document. Why do I need to do that? Why do I need this document versus something else? Well, the purpose for this document is for you and your client to agree that you are representing your client. Okay? It's disclosing to your client. If you read through here, it's used by both the buyer and the seller side. And it can be used in leasing relationships as well, but we're gonna talk just about sales in here. But and it's just an explanatory document. It tells your client what your obligations are and what you're expected to do, and they're agreeing that they understand this, okay? So for example, it's got seller's agent, and those are the terms, by the way, that are used now. Seller's agent means what? There used to be listing agent and selling agent, which is what you were talking about, right? What are the more modern term is, right there, seller's agent. Who do you think the seller's agent represents? The seller. Okay, again, some of these are really obvious. And who do you think the buyer's agent represents? The buyer. And that's why they changed the terms, because that's pretty obvious, right? It was not obvious, at least it wasn't to me when I first got into the business. When I saw the term selling agent, I always thought, my first thought was the listing agent. Then my next thought was the buyer's agent, because I learned it wasn't the listing agent. So I had to go through that process almost every time. And they finally, after all the confusion of thousands of agents for years and years, they've gone to this buyer's and seller's agent. Wow. And that can be how slow car acts, by the way. So anyway, it says what a seller's agent does, it says what a buyer, now you should read all of these forms. I'm not gonna go through every provision of every form. But if you're gonna educate yourself and use your tools properly, which are your forms, you need to read them, okay? So this tells what the buyer's agent does, seller's agent does. Also says the agent can represent both buyer and seller. What's that called? Dual agency, right. Do we like that as agents?
Yeah.
Yes and no. I
I
want
like
you to
it.
always say yes and no.
Not a problem.
Yeah, the question is, are you feeling lucky? Okay? Because dual agency can be a real benefit. Obviously, you end up earning both sides of the commission. But it can also be a problem, because if your buyer and seller start having problems with each other, then it challenges your loyalty, doesn't it? Who do you represent, the buyer or the seller? Truth is, you represent both, and you can't take sides. And that can be difficult because often you will need to give specific advice that's really for the buyer, and it will hurt the seller. Like when you give advice as a buyer's agent about what the price should be, you know, you shouldn't be paying more than this, that's, you know, counter to what the seller wants you to do, right? Now, there's little rules that cover all of that. I'm just saying that the completion in a difficult situation creates conflicts of interest, and you've got to manage it carefully. If you sense that it may start amicably and you sense things starting to break down, it's sometimes wise to even bring in another agent and say, look, this is obviously breaking down a little bit, or we're having some discussions that are, it's hard for me to represent both sides of this. And so you bring in another agent to give advice strictly to that, and you have to work it out. Dale, you've done a lot of dual agency.
We actually recommended here
Yeah,
that you have an agreement with another agent in the office and that you never do dual agency. Because in a court of law, it's hard to say that you were impartial.
right.
And that's what our job is to be. We can't take sides. And how do you tell, as Mike's just said, how do you tell a judge I didn't take sides when you advise the seller and you advise the buyer? So we always try to say, okay, if there's another agent that you're comfortable with, have them represent the buyer, and when they do a dual agency, you be their buyer.
Right.
It's just one layer. It may be a very thin layer, but it might be the layer that saves you in a court of law.
Yeah, and it's very helpful because the agency, by the way, Keller Williams is still a dual agent, even in that situation.
Mm-hmm.
But at least you know that the buyer and seller are getting independent advice. And hopefully that helps bring whatever issue may be there to conclusion. Okay? But that's wise advice. We've just had, too many situations where all of a sudden it seems like it's gonna be fine and then it's not. And by the time it's not, it's hard to recover from sometimes. So, but anyway, it's explained here. You're authorized to be a dual agent, and the agency certainly is authorized. If two agents in the same office are representing the buyer and the seller, the brokerage is still a dual agency. Okay? Just so you know. So that's why it's covered here.
Or we just tell them what to do.
And then they just sign it, and you complete the boxes, and there you go. Okay? Any questions on that? So that's just a disclosure. There's no agreements other than you designate who you're representing, and they agree that that's who you're representing. Okay? And this is, by the way, this is all statutory language. It's all demanded by California statutes, which is why it's demanded to be part of the RPA. And then what's this next form? What's that called? Fair Housing and Discrimination Advisory. What's that for?
Gender, race, religion.
Right. It's basically to advise your client that you are not allowed, and you don't want to, be involved in any kind of discrimination on the basis of any of those things that we just talked about, any criteria really, and that the laws of California and state and federal laws prohibit it. So it's really designed for you to inform your buyer or seller that, as realtors, we don't participate in any kind of discrimination, but you don't have to actually say it, because it's on the form, and you ask them to read it and sign it. And so you don't have to have the discussion, just don't do it, okay? Do not discriminate, period. Don't allow it to occur. Yeah,
This might be me going out on a limb, and, because we're talking
I
about.
hope it's not one that I have to saw off behind you.
Yeah. But question, if someone does have those prejudices, should they not even be in this business? What's your opinion on that? I mean, that's where I'm getting at.
As you mean, be real estate agents?
Yeah, exactly.
I think it would be very, very difficult to comply with the law. And, now everybody's got biases at some level, but any active outward biases that people are acting on intentionally, you just shouldn't be in the business, in my opinion.
Yeah.
You can't do it, it'd be hard to follow the law. Yeah.
Mike, is this the reason now that sellers, listing agent is not allowed to show a letter from the buyer? Remember how the buyer used to write, "Hi, we're the Smiths, and
Yeah.
we're like this and we're like that." Is that the reason that now we can't do that anymore?
I wanted to get to, that's a very good
That's
question.
what I-
You know, well, you're.
My understanding.
You're
What do you know
educating
about
me
that?
now, so you're saying that you can't present a
There's
letter?
there's a new law that came out that a listing agent cannot present,
You mean a
letter.
buyer's agent?
no, well, the buyer's agent can send it, but the
Oh,
list.
you can't present it to the seller.
Exactly,
Can't present
Okay.
the
because
seller
it's a
along with
picture of the
document.
family with the dog, and this is who we are, because
For
it
the
could be.
Christian family.
Exactly.
And I
I've
say
seen
things
that
like,
before.
will really fit in with this neighborhood.
Exactly.
Fit in this
Well,
neighborhood
but
where-
you just can't send the letter anymore, no matter what it said.
Oh.
So that just
That must
passed
be-
recently, and I was wondering if it was a part of that.
I would think it probably is in the
Mhm.
sense that, there's implicit bias.
Mhm.
And you don't know, the realtors may not be biased, but you don't know about your buyers and
Correct.
sellers.
Mhm.
And what they're hiding underneath the surface.
Yes.
So, especially sellers.
Mm-hmm.
And we all know that at one time, there were written in restrictions
I know.
against selling to certain kinds of, to other races and those
Races,
kinds of things.
religions.
All of that is illegal, it's all been removed. If it's still in your CC&Rs, the laws have held them not to be enforceable. But, I guess that makes sense.
It just came out the
It's
last
something-
30 days.
I'll have to
Yeah,
check that
not
though, I
long
didn't realize there was a law that says.
It just came out, that the buyer,
Who
Kind
told
of
you that, was
could
that
do-
Simon?
That was Simon, could you check into that?
what was that?
Didn't Simon bring that up?
He brought it up because
Oh,
it was.
yeah, I heard it somewhere else.
It was
too.
actually on the
Yeah.
news.
Yeah, it was, so,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, Mike, if you could check into that, that'd be great. So let me put my unauthorized lawyer's hat on, to this question.
Unauthorized
So
lawyer.
let's say for instance,
Now, if this becomes a legal opinion that you want, I charge for that.
okay.
What's your going rate?
$1.98.
So let's say, for instance, I ask my seller or my buyers to write a letter that has nothing to do with any of those items, but that I love your house, and it's only about and it's all the bells and whistles about their house, and that's
Well,
not
what,
sure
I
that
think
would
what I have to do before I can answer that is actually see what the law says.
Yeah.
If the law talks about you can't say certain things in a letter versus you can't deliver a letter. One's an absolute prohibition against the activity, the other is, a restriction as to content. And, if restriction as to content is.
How do you monitor that then?
Is appropriate, then you can do it. But if it's an absolute prohibition, because they're concerned about the
Yeah.
edges, where do you draw the
Yeah,
lines in
and I
content?
think many of them say they picture the family with that.
They often do.
And that's an issue.
Yeah.
Now, is
I
this
can
California?
understand
Now,
too, but the
if you
thing
just
is, though-
include a picture of the dog, you're probably okay.
Even then.
Even cats.
We
If
like
he wants
cat
to
people.
pee in your backyard, he does.
But here we are in our money, we're representing the sellers, let's say, for instance, and the sellers, and we know that there's, in this kind of an market, we've got multiple offers, okay? And then the seller, we know, is mom and pop, they've been in this house for years, and they've raised their kids and their grandkids, and they wanna know that the person that's going to be buying, the couple that's going to be buying this house, is someone that dearly loves this house and is going to be there, raise their kids for years, as opposed to someone that's going to take it, rip it down, or turn it into an investment property. Now, we're representing the seller, okay? And we know that. And so how are we going to and so they're gonna be looking to us. But now, if the other buyer does not present this kind of
Profile, right?
profile,
Right.
then the seller, our clients, do not have a, so I'm just.
I understand what you're saying.
I've been asked that question.
What's that?
I've been asked that question, just
Yeah.
as you said. I said, I'm sorry, I never met the buyer. Because most of the time, you don't.
Right.
Yeah.
There's a lockbox, they let themselves in and say, by the way, we're not allowed to ask that.
Right.
I'm not gonna go down that road.
You
Yeah,
don't
I
have
You
to
know,
go
maybe
there.
he's asking innocently, and maybe he isn't, and I'm not gonna engage in that.
Mhm.
So
Right.
that's what I just
Yeah.
tell them, I'm
I
sorry.
agree with that.
Yeah.
So, but the thing is, without having the ability of a buyer to present that, then the seller doesn't know, and
Yeah, I think it's-
and we're on the hook.
Well, and this goes to, and again, I haven't read this law, so I'll have to take a look at it and see what it says, but certain things about it, as we're talking about it, strike me as difficult for constitutional reasons. I mean, how can you tell a seller you're not allowed to meet your buyer? I mean, in contracting, the buyer is the actual person you're contracting with.
Yeah.
So
never
I'm just saying, I don't know. I don't know the answer. They may have written a law, I don't know how enforceable it is.
Yeah.
But we always follow the law until we find out it's not enforceable, so. but
I always
also the
educate my
discrimination.
seller, I do not think it's a good idea for you to meet the buyer.
Right. No, but I'm
Because
just saying,
something could be
if
said
the seller.
innocently, and we could lose the deal, you can meet them at the walkthrough if you
Yeah.
wanna be here.
I
totally agree with that.
Yeah,
I
I
agree.
do too.
Yeah,
And many times I've told a seller, the walkthroughs today, I don't think you should be here.
yeah.
I'll show them
They
how to
should
do the
ever.
stove.
I agree.
Yeah,
Yeah, and that's because this is not a relationship.
No,
exactly,
it's an exchange.
The divorce occurs the day after the wedding, right?
I
So
don't know if I
there's-
like your analogy. It's way
Anything
too,
that was a possibility.
you need to come up with a better one.
All right, fine. I'm open to suggestions.
The other thing I was gonna say, Mike, while you're there, you know, especially for the new
Yeah.
agents, what I do is I make templates. The WinForms is so good.
Oh, yes.
That you make a template for the buyer, for the seller, for the lease listing. I have 3 templates. But I would like for you maybe to let us know what are the forms that you need for the buyer, what are the forms
Yeah,
that you need
I'd
for
like
the
to do it
seller.
that way too.
Because that would help all our agents. We could put the verbiage in that you mentioned that we put in, and it's there for every deal. And it
It's
makes
incredibly
it-
helpful. When
Yes,
I first
very
started in this
helpful.
business, when there was triplicates.
Yes, I remember that.
Just to date,
Yeah.
just to date us. Anyone who's been in the business long enough to know that. You would too.
You probably saw it. You probably
I
had
know
books
what
you
all
looked at.
new
but
agents-
let's-
Actually, there used to be 4.
Yeah, okay.
Buyer,
Yeah,
seller,
there's 4.
buyer's agent,
Yeah.
and seller's agent. By the 4th, and I
One
remember
that we
when,
kept.
what
and
was
then
the
there
black,
that
what was
too,
the blue
to
paper?
all of them.
Carbon?
Carbon paper. By the time you got to the 4th one, you couldn't read anything.
That's why you would say, please sign here, press hard.
And the big innovation was they went to NPR forms.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes,
But I was
exactly.
gonna say
Yes.
that the,
But I created a template when I first
create
got it. Yeah.
templates is so easy.
When I first took my
I-
talks.
I
well,
update mine every year.
I'm sure the agent services and all that will be teaching
Well, maybe,
you
yeah.
how to do zip forms, which is where you'll do all of that.
Mhm.
And now we'll go
We
through
should
on
have
these
a class
forms that we're
down
going
now.
through.
And one of the girls.
We'll go through what the kind of the standard customs are,
Yeah.
okay?
And what-
Like when
what's
we go through
required,
cost
when you-
al-
well, yeah,
when we
when
go
you
through
do
cost
RPA,
allocation and all
yeah.
of that, we'll go through what the custom is. Keeping in mind that all of it's negotiable, but most of it's pretty standard.
It is pretty standard. When you do a listing contract or an RPA, what goes with it
Yeah.
normally?
But let's get through, we're almost out of time here, so let's
Yes.
just click through these. Any questions on the fair housing? That's newer, by the way, that hasn't always been in there as part of the package,
What's that?
the new housing.
Oh, right.
Now, possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, disclosure and consent. So what's this form for? Now, keep in mind, any disclosure, any advisory form, it's not an agreement. What's it doing?
Advising.
It's advising, that's right, that's exactly what it's doing. It is conveying information. And it's